This video contains first episode spoilers for The Promised Neverland. The Promised Neverland, or Yakusoku no Neverland, is a show that takes place in a setting very familiar in popular culture, that of an idyllic English orphanage. We can infer that it is English by the architecture, the scenery, and of course the name of the orphanage, Grace Fieldhouse. This supposedly innocent setting, and the dystopian horrific reality that it masquerades for, are familiar even to those who haven't read the works that originally established them. The purpose of this video is to introduce some of those works and briefly state the similarities and differences of their themes to those of The Promised Neverland so that you can get an idea of how these ideals were developed in the past and have come to become so recognizable. For my comparison, I've picked out 4 British authors who are each active about a century apart from each other. Before I begin, I had investigated whether Kazuo Shirai, the writer of the series, actually was influenced directly by the works I will cover, given some of the significant similarities. As far as I have found, however, the answer is no. In a couple of interviews, the only Western influences he mentions are Frozen, Die Hard, and The Good Son, a fairly unpopular 1993 thriller. However, with works as influential as the ones that I will be covering, I believe it is fair to say that they have influenced them indirectly through their force on popular culture as a whole. The first piece places us in 1729. Jonathan Swift, dissatisfied with English policy towards his native Ireland, wrote a modest proposal as a satirical criticism against those who disregarded the poor by suggesting that hunger, poverty, and a variety of social and economic ills of Ireland could be remedied by raising human children for consumption. The work is not that long, and in addition to being one of the most famous satires ever written, it's the absolute apex of literature written on the subject of eating children, so I can definitely recommend giving it a read. In terms of things to think about, consider the calculative mood that Swift adopts for parody, and how things we might find revulsive can be justified or even logical. You could also consider how just as Swift perceives Ireland being treated as a secondary world, subservient to the needs and policies of England, the only world that the orphans in The Promised Neverland know is one that is completely and secretly subservient to the demonic world. In the 19th century, in 1837, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens began publication. In just the first few chapters, Dickens establishes the prototype of a broken orphanage which has persisted to the modern day, epitomized by the iconic scene where Oliver Twist asks for a second serving of gruel. This scene, which I was surprised to discover, occurs in chapter 2, alongside an adroit and again satirical description of hardship and hunger. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the story, not at all related to The Promised Neverland, but for just the part on orphanage life, I would recommend reading up to about chapter 7. Dickens wrote the story in part as a protest against welfare reforms in England at the time, particularly those that forced people to live in squalid workhouses to receive government assistance. A particular target of his scorn in the book is orphanages that would be paid per child that they kept and that tried to expend as few resources on the orphans as possible so the owners could pocket the difference. In the worst cases, some women would allow babies in their care to die or even intentionally kill them in a practice known as baby farming. The connection here is again fairly obvious. The orphanages that were just baby farms in The Promised Neverland, which depicts a literal farm, share an underlying motive, even if one is made profitable through neglect and the other through nourishment and enrichment. In either case, the motive is one that is to the detriment of the orphans we would expect to be the ones to benefit. Even though it depicts orphanages in almost the complete opposite way, Oliver Twist is still a great read to understand the origin of the popular collective imagination for what a broken orphanage system is like. Next, in 1949, well, you might have seen it coming, but this video really can't avoid mentioning George Orwell's 1984. The work needs no introduction, it's hugely popular, accessible, and always relevant. Rereading the book for this video, I noticed so many details relevant to The Promised Neverland that I had really completely forgotten about. It's not just that mom runs the orphanage like the totalitarian state of Oceania, it's the various mechanisms of control that are employed that are really interesting. There's not just the usage of surveillance, but the paranoia that comes with not knowing exactly when you're being watched or listened in on, forcing you to assume that you're always under scrutiny. There's not just the possibility of a traitor, but also the constant doubt of who can be trusted when anybody could reasonably be a suspect. The idea of escape is also explored in 1984, but in a similar way to what happens in The Promised Neverland, where you wonder not just if it's possible, but also what the outside world might look like when the world that you belong to is the only thing you've ever known. I haven't read the source of The Promised Neverland, that is to say the manga, but I suspect 1984 will continue to be relevant as the story progresses. There's also an interesting point of contrast. The idea of collective action and salvation is a critical aspect of the Promised Neverland, driving many aspects of the plot and the plan to escape, and the conflicts between the characters. In contrast, Winston's journey is ultimately a solitary one through most of the events of 1984. Our last work is the 2005 novel Never Let Me Go by Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro, who grew up in the United Kingdom. This one is a bit hard to talk about because it's not nearly as famous as the other works mentioned, so I'm reluctant to spoil too much about the plot and its themes, which are translucent through most of the story. The themes are developed slowly, and you engage with them in different ways as you follow the plot and the characters. What I can say is that if you really enjoyed The Promised Neverland, this is absolutely a work you should check out. This is because you'll quickly find that even though superficially the setting is one that is very similar to that of The Promised Neverland, so much so that in my research I found Japanese blog posts addressing faint possibilities of plagiarism of Never Let Me Go, the way that the characters of Never Let Me Go react to their situation is quite different than the plans to escape in The Promised Neverland, though I hesitate to say that they are complete opposites. Hopefully my meaning will become clear as you read the book. Again, I highly suggest this book. It's very well written, and the language is contemporary, that is to say, very easy to read. It's much less action-based than The Promised Neverland, but it induces a lot of consideration and reflection. There's also a movie adaptation of the novel, which is fairly well received, but I recommend the book as an entry point and the film as supplementary material. I hope with this video I've given you some idea of the literary works out there that have similarities to The Promised Neverland, and perhaps explain why the setting is one that is naturally resonant with us. Most of all, for the stories whose descriptions may have interest you, I hope that you check them out for different interpretations of similar themes. The first two works by Swift and Dickens are in fact in the public domain and are readily available online. Thank you.